open up Philippians 1 if you would like to go ahead and do that. We're going to be spending a little bit of time there. I want to call your attention to these little dillies that are in the seats there. This isn't really for you. This is for you to hand out to your neighbors and friends to invite them to come to be with us on September the 16th. It is National Back to Church Sunday, something that churches are doing all over the country. We're going to be a part of that as well. Fairly low key here in what we do on that particular Sunday morning. We're going to be really mindful of what we say and kind of how we interact with folks, and really mindful of our guests, and want you to invite all that you can. Maybe it's somebody that you made contact with over our summer of blessing. Whatever it might be, we want you to come and just bring them with you. Maybe take them to lunch after that. Or if you're here and you didn't have anybody with you, you see some guests about, maybe invite them to lunch after service, or to breakfast, kind of a mid-breakfast lunch kind of thing if you're here at first service. And let's enjoy that day together. I'm going to talk about things like grace and hope and the general message of Jesus, kind of fundamental, foundational things from our perspective. But we're going to be really mindful of those folks. And I may even tell a story or two that you've heard me say before. And you just go, wow, that's awesome, isn't it? When you hear me say something you've heard me say before. But we're going to be reaching out to those folks, and just want you to be mindful of that. So grab a hold of those and take them with you. If you want some more, Tim Shoulders can give you some more, and you'll be able to invite some folks in on that particular day. So that's 2 weeks from today, right? September the 16th. I'd like for us to now just take a moment. Let's go back 1 week. Let's go back to last week, and I want to reintroduce you to a lady that we talked about. Her name is Bonnie Ware. She is a nurse in Australia. If you were here last week, you might remember this, a palliative care nurse. She deals with patients that are moving from life to death. They're transitioning, right? She spends on average about 12 weeks with these folks as they make that transition from living to not living. And one of the things that she said in an interview last February, and that's what we were making reference to, was her interview, February of 2012. She said she is constantly amazed by the phenomenal clarity of vision that these folks have. It's one thing, and we all know this, we all know that death is out there, right? But that's different from knowing that it's right there. Right? And it changes your perspective incredibly on how you look at life and how you look at a whole lot of things. And so as they go through this transition, one of the things that they deal with and that they talk about are regrets, dying regrets, the things that you wish you shoulda, woulda, coulda, whatever that might be. And she said, really, over her years of experience, that several common themes began to emerge in all of that. And she listed 5, and they weren't in numeric order like number 1, number 2, number 3, and so on and so forth. But these were the 5 most common. Like, for example, one of them, she said she heard from every male patient that she had up until last February, and that was, I wish I hadn't spent so much time working. We talked about that one a little bit last week. That kind of struck me. But where we really camped out last week was on this one that expressed a bit of regret about not having spent enough time with friends. I didn't give my relationships and friendships the time that they deserved. And so that led us into talking about how connected are we? Because I don't want to come up to the end of my life and have a regret like that. Do you? I mean, friendships and relationships are really in large measure what defines who we are. I mean, it's just hard to get around it. It really is just a significant part of meaning in life comes from that. So we talked about connecting and how we're connecting. And then from there, we went pretty quickly to church. Are we really connecting here? Are we a body that connects? And so we let Paul lead us through 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 11 through 14, if you remember that. And he described what a connecting church looked like and how it is that we all contribute to that, so that we're people that allow that connection, and we're people that are following God in his lead and leading people in to connect. Now, we're going to kind of continue that theme of connection, as you can see by looking at your screen there. But we're going to go back to one of those other dying regrets to kind of get into it. And here it is. Last week it was number 3 on our list, but it is a desire. Take a look at your screen just for a moment. It is that desire to be happy. I wish I'd let myself be happier. That's kind of rocks me a little bit. Because I'm going to tell you the honest truth. I don't want to come to the end of my life and thinking about my only shot at it. And we're in it right now, right? It's our only shot. I don't want to come up thinking, man, really, when all has been said and done and the dust is starting to settle, I don't want to look back and think that I could have been happier than what I was. I didn't make the choices that I could have made, and happiness really is in large measure a choice. Or is it? see, I got to thinking about that, and I don't know, I'm a little bit obsessive. Do we have anybody else that's obsessive compulsive in okay? Oh, yeah, I know, Monica. Yeah, you are. Okay, baby, I know. All right, so there's 4 or 5 honest people in here, and there's some things that I can kind of get a little more obsessive compulsive about than others, but I started asking myself the question, well, am I a happy guy right now? If I'm going to look at that and think about it, am I happy right now? Do I have any regrets right now about that? Am I happy right now? And so I started kind of checking my life against, and if you're obsessive compulsive, you can really get into all this stuff. I started checking my life against this kind of inner core evaluation that I have of what happy ought to look like, and sort of measuring that. And then here's where I went. I started thinking, well, what is happiness? I mean, what is it? It's kind of a thing that you feel maybe, but is it just totally subjective? What is that? If I'm really happy, I need to know what that is. And then here's where my mind went. Does God really care if I'm happy? I don't want to sound all glum, but that's kind of popped into my head. And happiness is sort of an odd thing, because it really is connected a lot to circumstances. We have some choices to make, but there's a lot in life. My happiness is contributed to by good things and good circumstances. But see, there's so much of life is not happy. So much of life is really, really difficult, and it makes it hard to be, happy. And so, is it God's will? Is it God's desire that I be happy? And if it is, He's got a funny way of showing that, doesn't He? Because life is tough. It is really, really tough. Is it His desire that I go around grinning all the time? Is that what it is? Eric Wilson is a fellow. Let me tell you about this guy just for a second. He's a professor at Wake Forest University. And he decided one day that he wanted to be happier. At least he wanted people to think that he was happier. He was going to put a smile on his face more instead of them seeing the scowl that he normally had on his face all the time. So he bought a bunch of books about how to be happy. And there's a lot of them out there to buy, y'all. In fact, there's 50 more this year published, new ones, about how to be happy than there was last year. And 50 more than that from the year before. So, I mean, we're really hungry, man. We want to be happy about them. So here he is. He buys him some books, and he starts looking at movies that make you chuckle, movies that are happy, kind of have a good feeling, and he starts thinking about that. And he starts sprinkling his conversation with words like great and wonderful and coolio and all this sort of stuff. So people will really, and he's trying to get into the mood of all that, But at the end of the day, he kind of gave up on it. It just wasn't working for him. And he went back to his melancholy self. And it sort of embittered him a little bit. So he began to react to what he calls the happiness movement, and it popped up in the 1990s. Are you aware of what I'm talking about? Really, that's where the plethora of, and I love that word, y'all, plethora, where it kind of begins to emerge is in the 90s, and it carries right on through the last decade of the 2000s, and it carries through there. And so he decided to write a book called Against Happiness. Okay? Now, I don't know that I'm going to go that far about all of that, but what he's talking about is that there's a large part of life. Listen, there's a large part of your experience right now that it may be a lot of things, but it's not happy. So then it strikes me, and it's a thought that had struck me before. It had struck me earlier, and we may even have talked about it a little bit. But my mind went to this. There's something better than happy. Greater than happy. The real pearl, the real gem in all of this is joy. Because joy doesn't really have anything to do with my circumstances. Right? In fact, joy embraces not only those happy circumstances, but embraces the sad circumstances and the mad circumstances and the upsetting circumstances. Joy is impervious to that, and it's a bit of something that I just settle on and I decide. It's a little hard to decide about choosing happiness, but I can seize joy. Now, here's the thing, and what really got me to kind of really capturing that this go around is something that Jesus said on the night of his betrayal. I mean, you think about that moment. Death is not out there for him. It's right here. And it's not an easy thing. It's a horrible thing that he's about to embrace. And nobody around him understands. You talk about alone. Nobody understands it. He looks him in the eye. That's the night where he sweated, as it were, great drops of blood, if you remember the history of it, in anguish, pouring out his life. And yet he says to his disciples, my joy I give to you. And not just my joy, but my peace I give to you. And it's a peace that nobody, no thing, nothing can take away. Now, one of the guys that really picked up on that was a guy named Paul. He was named Saul. He was a fastidious man of righteousness. He was a legalist to the core. He lived legalism, and his sense of purpose and his sense of identity came from his legalistic stuff that he did with all that blah, blah, blah stuff that he did. But then he met a guy one day on the road to Damascus who had been executed somewhere 7 to 10 years earlier, and this guy appears to him. And the guy that I'm talking about, of course, is Jesus, right? The Lord Jesus Christ appeared to him and said, I don't know why you're kicking against the goads here, but this path that you're on, that somehow another religion makes sense if you can legalize it, and if you can, and somehow, and that really Judaism is the way, the path. He said, you're on the wrong direction. And so he set him on this new path. And Paul, whose name was Saul, began to live a totally different way, a life of joy in spite of what went on. Now, there's something there that I want to capture. He wound up writing about 13 or so, give or take, books of the New Testament. And the book that really speaks to all of this is the book that I asked you to turn to just a moment ago. It's the book of Philippians. All right? Now, we did a little series on Philippians about 5 or 6 years ago. And you may remember some of the things, some general things about that book. You may remember a whole lot more than that, not just from that series, but from your own study. One of the reasons it speaks so much to it is that 18 times in 4 little chapters, he uses the word joy, or the word rejoice. And what's even more incredible about it is that he's sitting in a Roman prison as he writes those words. Now, folks, prisons, especially Roman prison back in those days, was not, they didn't have an hour a day to go do exercises. And they didn't eat 3 square meals a day. If there wasn't somebody there to take care of you, you were really in sad shape. And when he writes this to the Philippians, and they know that he's in prison, there was sort of a picture that popped into their brains, because he went into a Roman prison when he went to Philippi to plant the church there. And you remember what they did to him and Silas? You remember they beat him with rods. And then they took him and threw him into the inner prison and put him in stocks and chains and bonds and left him there. Now, that wasn't because the people in Philippi thought they were particularly bad. You realize that's what happened to you when you went into a Roman prison. That was just standard procedure, to let you know that you are not all that much. Let you know that you're not anything. In fact, standard procedure was to strip you naked, beat you with a whip or beat you with rods, and then throw you into the stocks, throw you into the chains in the inner prison, to let you know it ain't no picnic. And we don't care who you are or who you think you are. Here's where it is. And the amazing thing, when you think about Paul's life, do you realize that he spent almost 1/4 of his missionary life in prison? It was a nasty place to be. Dark. In the wintertime, it was unbearably cold. In the summertime, it was brutally hot. And the smell, here's what comes through history. Here's the testimony of history. The stench was unbearable. So unbearable, you could not sleep. And I'm talking about just the stench of human filth. Not enough toilets to go around, all kinds of stuff going on in there. You could not sleep. And if you did manage to sleep, you couldn't stay asleep. So the circumstances so horrendous that there were people that would beg guards to kill him. Just kill me. I don't even want to. And of course the guards, you're nothing to us. That's not going to happen. And so they've invented some pretty ingenious ways to kill themselves. That's how bad it was. And then you have a guy in the middle of that. Years later, here he is in prison again, writing to the Philippians. And what's the key word in his book? Joy. I am rejoicing, and I'm telling you, I want you. You have never seen anything like that in your life. Not in our cushy, prissy, sissy life, and I'm thankful for that, by the way, in the 21st century. You've never seen anything like that. You find a guy and and he says something like that, you better listen to what he has to say. So in the book of Philippians, it's like a guy that has a secret. Like he knows something that nobody else knows. In fact, he says something like that in chapter 4. If you look at chapter 4 and verse 12, and this isn't on your screen because I sort of just stuck that in here just now. If you look at verse 12, he says over there, he says, I know how to live with a lot, and I know how to live without very much at all. I've learned the secret of living beyond my circumstances. I've learned the secret of life so that it doesn't matter really what's going on here. I'm beyond that. And then he gives the secret. He unveils it. And I do have that passage for you. It's verse 13. I can do all things, and probably a lot of us in here have that passage memorized, right? I can do all things through him who strengthens me. He didn't say, I can do all things, right? Because that's a dumb thing to say. I see those people every once in a while. They're athletes sometimes, doing their thing. Or they're movie stars or whatever. You can just see it. They think they are beyond, they can do anything. That's nutty. You can't. But I can do all things through him who empowers me, including living this life of joy. In fact, if you let your eyes drift down through chapter 4 just for a minute, he kind of gives some guidelines that you can go through. That's not really what we're here to talk about today, but I just want you to kind of look at that. Like he says in chapter 4, go ahead and make the decision. Go ahead and make the decision. Rejoice in the Lord, he says. Always do it. Just make that choice. And you can do it in him. All right? I don't think you're going to be able to kind of manipulate things around to make that fit without him, because it's nutty, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of insane to do that because we're all dying, y'all. I mean, here's the honest truth. We're all dying, and it may seem something more to some of us than others of us, but that's the honest truth. I mean, you can't deny that. So he said, in the Lord, you can make that choice. And he says, not only that, he says, look at verse 5. I want you to start rolling with the punches. Let your forbearing spirit, that's what he means by forbearing. Don't dig your heels in and make an obstinate, unyielding demand for things to always be your way. Roll with it, roll with it. And then he says in verse 6, don't worry about your stuff, pray about your stuff. And here's a key phrase in verse 6. Do it with thanksgiving. Always remember to be thankful. There's something about being thankful that sort of just kind of makes it right. Be thankful for whatever it is. I don't know what's going on with you, but you find something in that to be thankful for. And then he says in verse 8, he says, look, practice conscious thought control. Think about those things that are true and right and lovely and pure and good. And he says, here's what's going to happen. The God of peace will start to dwell with you. He says, whatever you have seen and heard in me, that's what he's saying to the Philippians. Do you see that? That's what he says in chapter 4. Whatever you've seen or heard in me, this is verse 9. You don't have that verse either. I want you to put those things into practice. What do you see in Paul? You see a guy who has captured the essence of joy. He's captured joy. Now, let's flip over to chapter 1 just for a second. He tells us why he's so joyful. He kind of tells you some things about how, and he reveals his secret there, verse 13 of chapter 4. But what does that look like day to day? Okay, so see, you hear all that, but I got a life that I live in. So how do I choose to rejoice? And how do you forbear really when you got to work with that knothead that you have to work with or live with? How do you choose that? What does that look like? Well, chapter 1 is a demonstration. He's unfolding his life. He's just unfolding his life for everybody to look at. And what he reveals in there are 3 sources of joy. You ever notice with preachers things come in threes? Have y'all ever noticed that? You get 3 points and you do 3 things. Well, but I'm going to break tradition here because we're not going to talk about all 3. All right. The last one he gives is verse 21. It's where you make up your mind. For me to live as Christ and to die as gain. And that's probably the highlight of the book. But we've talked about that a lot. And if you want to talk about that some more, come see me afterwards and we'll talk about the power of making up your mind. There's power in making up your mind. That little verse occurs right in the middle of some conversation about I don't know if I'm going to live or die. I think I'm going to live because it makes sense to me that God would not take me yet because you still need me for some stuff. And so he says, I'm kind of conclude that this is not the end. And by the way, his final journey was not till about another 6 to 10 years later. So he was right about that. But he says, really, at the end of the day, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. It's like D.L. Moody, Dwight Moody. You ever heard of that guy? He was floating on he was out there on one of the Great Lakes. He was a preacher of 2 or 3 generations ago. He was out there on the Great Lakes and a storm, it's in the middle of the night, a storm comes up and it's a bad storm. And so you got all the passengers are cowering in fear and they're doing one thing and another. And they decide to have an impromptu prayer session. And so they invite Moody, the great evangelist, to come pray, and he declines. He's not going to pray. And they said, why? He said, and this is what he's reported to have said. He said, well, I've got a sister in Chicago, and I've got a sister in heaven, and I don't really care which one I see tonight. Did you get that? You get that? That's Paul's heart here. Whatever happens, see, that's what joy does for you. That's joy. That's joy. It really doesn't matter. So that's the third thing that he talks about. Second thing that he talks about is his ministry. What we're interested in is the first source of joy that he talks about in chapter 1. Y'all with me? Am I talking too fast? Are we cool? Y'all with me on this? And that's what he talks about in verses 3 through 8. All right? And here it is. Let me just kind of lay it out so you can kind of have it in your brain as we kind of go with it. We could deduce it, but let me just sort of lay it out. As we look at those verses, one of his key sources of joy, he's going to say it outright, but one of his key sources of joy, you know what it is? It's church. It's his brothers and sisters. It's the potential of us. It's incredible to me. You say, well, he didn't go to church where I go to church. Hang on. You're going to find out everything's got its lining, all right, as we're going to see here in just a second. But it's church. It's church. In fact, look at how he starts off here in verse 3. He says, I thank my God every time I remember you. Already joy is starting to roll off his pen, isn't it? I thank God every time I remember you. You got anybody like that in your life? Every time you think about him, just a smile comes on your face, huh? I thank God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy. That word occurs 5 times in chapter 1. Here's the first time. It's going to occur 4 more times before you get to verse 26. All right? I pray with joy. Why? First word of verse 5. Because. Because why? My relationship with you. A relationship's not the word that he uses. The word that he has here is partnership. Or you may have a translation that says fellowship. Or you may have a translation that says you share with me in the gospel. It all comes from one single Greek word, koinonia. It has all those notions. It's got all those ideas. Every one of them's in there. Partnership, fellowship, sharing. We share something together. And what he's particularly talking about here is that you've shared in my ministry. We've gone the lengths together. In my mission work, we've done it all. We've done all of it together. It's all been great. It's all been wonderful. In chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, he says, you've been with me in that from the first day. You've been with me in that from the day that this church was established. In fact, there were points in my ministry where you were the only guys that stood by me. And so a bond occurred. And I pray with joy, he says, back in chapter 1, I pray with joy because, wow, we're partners. We are in fellowship. We have something, not just something in common. We're drawn together by a mission on this planet. And I find joy in that because we've stood together in all of that. So he says in verse 7, it's right for me to feel this way about you since I have you in my heart. Who's in your heart? Who's in your heart? That's where the relationships really live, where they really abide, isn't it? He looked into his heart, and what did Paul see in his heart? It's full of Philippians. You know what my heart's full of? Really, truly, full of Sugar Grove. What's your heart full of? He says, it's right for me to feel this way since I have you in my heart. For whether I'm in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. We are tied together. We are connected. God can testify how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. Some of you may have in your Bible, it may say with the tender mercies of Christ Jesus. And this is a word we've looked at before because this is not the only place where it's found. Splagnon. You know what it means literally? Guts. I love you with the guts of Jesus. If you got a King James, it says bowels. Other translations since then have cleaned it up a little bit and called it tender mercies. NIV calls it affection, and that's what it really is. I just feel so strongly for you. It's right here. It's right here. You're all over the inside of me. We're connected. One of his great sources of joy was this connection with each other. Now look, y'all, here's the take home. Here's the take home. One of those beautiful, one of the most beautiful opportunities you have to find those empty, to define, to isolate, and deal with those empty spots in your own life is right here in this room. Do you need to go out and buy another book on happiness? Is that what you need to do?
Can you hear me now?
I don't know, maybe you do. But let me tell you, at core, what you really need is not another book about happiness. You need to connect with your people. That's what we really need. We need to connect with our people. And Paul is giving an eloquent testimony affirming the power of church and who it is that we are and who we are and what we are as a collective body. It's amazing. And when I talk about connecting, I want to go back to something that I said last week just for a moment. I'm not just talking about coming to church, you know. I want you to come to church. Yeah, you do, because what God does here, according to Hebrews chapter 10, is empowers us for the week ahead. I mean, things happen. There's a kind of encouragement that occurs when we're in the large group together. It's undeniable when we sing together and pray together. What a wonderful time of worship this morning. As we do all of that together, it's beautiful. It's precious. So we need that. But we're talking about something more, like a connection through those Bible fellowship groups, or a connection through smaller groups. Maybe it's a ministry group. Maybe it's a life group. I hope everybody's connected in a life group. We're starting them up again. Here we are, right here in the fall. Or maybe it's a ministry group. Boy, you talk about something that spans a bridge, that spans some distance. You get involved with other folks in a ministry. And if you let that become sort of like a life group as well, where you're getting together just to be getting together to see each other and to tend to each other's needs. I mean, I've done funerals here where all the pallbearers were members of the life group. You know, there's some bonding that occurs, particularly over ministry, particularly when we come together to do some things. You know, it's the kind of bonding that occurs. The folks call it liminality, and I used that term last week. I noticed everybody looked at me kind of like, what are you, and I wouldn't know it if I didn't read that kind of material a lot, all the time, as a matter of fact. But it means to bond. It means that we stand together because it's what happens to football teams that go through hard times. You know, and all of a sudden here they are and they're standing together. You know, I still remember way back in junior high, the very first football team that I was ever part of, mainly because I thought, my gosh, these guys are going to kill me. These coaches are good. That's their destiny in life, is to take my life. And so we all kind of felt we'd never had anything like that before in our lives, and it just drew us all together. And we won games together, and we lost games together. We laughed together, and we cried together. I mean, it was, and so we bonded, and I still have those guys right here. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's what happens when a group goes to Honduras. Do you remember Jake Hatvanny? Jake, I saw you a while ago. Do you remember his testimony on the video, when we showed the video a few weeks ago? He said, you really get to know somebody when you're in a ditch with them. You remember him saying that? When you're digging a ditch with somebody, you really, what's he talking about? Liminality, that bonding that comes as we share in that stuff together. It's what happened in the Philippian church. It's what happens in church. That's how it goes. That's what it is. We have a connection, see? There's something that draws us together, and we just pull in and we connect. Now, look, let's don't make this something more glamorous than what it is. Church is church, right? Look around just for a second. Everybody look around. I'm looking to see if you're looking. So you better be looking. You know what you're seeing? People, just plain old people, kind of gimpy sometimes and sometimes okay, but just people. And that's the heart and the guts of church. All right, so let's don't over glamorize this thing. There's good people here. If you're like a guest and not one of the thousands of people that left Houston this weekend because it's a holiday weekend, if you're a guest here, you're kind of wondering what this is like. Let me tell you what. I don't know how many hundreds, I don't know what it is. I don't know what our population is right at the moment, 8 something. I don't know what it is. Can help me out. What is it, Richard? What is our... No, in here. How many members? 900 something, is that what it is? Really? Okay, so 900 something, so here you are. And that's basically good people. We got 900 good people and 5 or 6 cranky people. All right? We got some cranks? Yeah. Well, in fact, we got some nutty people here. Most of them in leadership, but anyway, they're nutty, they're nuts. You know, that's just people. And you can spend your life looking for the ideal church and never find it because it doesn't exist. or you can get connected to the real church. You know what this is right here? This is real. This is just real. It's real. And, you know, you think, and Paul, sometimes I have referred to the Philippian church in the past as Paul's sweetheart church, and it really was. He had a special place. But let me tell you what, they had their stuff. Flip over to chapter 4 just for a second and look at verses 2 to 3. And it's something kind of scary right there. He says, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche, these are two women, to agree with each other in the Lord. I'm begging you to get along. There's nothing in the world scarier than two angry sisters. Get out of the way. I'm here to tell you right now, I'd rather face 10 atheists than two angry sisters. I'll tell you any day of the week. Hey, Willie's saying, amen, brother. I urge you, Euodia, and I urge you, Syntyche, to get along. You know what some scholars think? They think the real reason Paul wrote this book is because of this fussing that these two women are doing. All the conversation about unity and all the conversation about being humble in Jesus, all of it is aimed toward these two women in his sweetheart church that are fussing. You think, not even with an apostle there was it ideal, right? And look how many people it affected. Yes, and I ask you, verse 3, loyal yoke fellow, or maybe he's talking about a fellow named Syzygus, if anybody would name their son Syzygus. Help these women who have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Two things about that. Even though they're fussing and at each other's throat, where are their names written? Thank God for his grace. Thank you, Jesus, for your grace. Right? And secondly, it just infected the entire body. Clement and Syzygus and all of these folks, everybody's all wrapped up. There is no ideal church. It's like family. Let me just tell you this and we're done, all right? It's like family. When my kids were little, I can talk about them right now because neither one of them are here today. They're off on vacation. So let me tell you what. I'd have these ideal things in my brain about how it was going to be, maybe how Christmas was going to, or how this vacation was going to be. I had all that, I would just kind of work it out in my head, how beautiful it was going to be. And it never worked out that way. I mean, it never worked out that way. There's a guy named Stuart Ruck, and you may know Stuart. He's a preacher up in the Midwest or over, kind of over to the Northwest a little bit, up in Apple country. And he says, let me tell you, he said, and it just resonated with me. And I thought, Stuart, you've been in my house. You've had to have been in my house. He said, one of the big things that we like to do is go apple picking during season. And he said, let me tell you the ideal apple picking day. The leaves on the trees are golden brown to rusty color, and those apples are big old red things just hanging there, on the deal. The weather is perfect, not a cloud in the sky. It's 75 degrees. We get up early in the morning and we all jump in the car and everybody's singing. We're singing as we go down and we're kind of loving on each other as we just make our way merrily down the road. Everybody in the car, you got the picture? Everybody's just great. We get there and to our surprise, we find out that they say, today it's free entry for families. So our kids get in there and they stuff themselves with apple cider and apple donuts and they never get a sugar high. At the end of the day, we start to come home and the kids are all over me, hugging my neck and hugging their mother's neck and saying, wow, you're the greatest mom and you're the greatest dad. This is just fantastic. It's just great. That's the ideal day. And I thought, man, I've had a lot of those days. How about you? Huh? That's why Karen changed the name of I used to have my mind all made up about what our family devotionals would look like. I think I've shared this with you before. Karen changed the name from family devotional to commotional. Because our kids had the idea that really what we were there for, we just wanted to see how dodo-headed they could be. That's what they wanted us to see. And so they would just get ridiculous. And so there's ideal, but then there's real. And he said, let me tell you the real trip to there. We get off late because everybody's got stuff that they got to do to go to the apple orchard. And so it gets so late, it shuts at 5. We're finally leaving about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's an hour and a half drive. So we're going to have 30 minutes there. And they're already saying, let's don't go. It's only 30 minutes. And I'm saying to them, you're going to get in that car and you're going to go because we're going to have fun. That's what we're here for. That's what we do. So we get in there and we go and their sugar is off the charts low because we haven't eaten lunch because we're trying to get ready. And he said, so my wife and I start to argue. She thinks it's my fault that we're late and I know it's her fault that we're late. So we're arguing and it's interrupted by the kids arguing in the back seat and I have to turn around and say, knock it off. I can't hear myself arguing with your mother. So be quiet back here. He said, we get there. It's late. All the good apples are gone. They charge us this exorbitant fee to get in, for city folks thinking they're going to spend a day out in the country. So we get out there, we get back in the car at night, and our closest thing we get to an apple is when we stop at McDonald's for an apple turnover. Now here's the deal. That's church. That's church. That's where we learn to accept and where we learn to forgive and where we learn to love and where we learn to draw close. That's what it is. Now, y'all, get connected. Just get connected. And I know what you're thinking. If you haven't yet, you're kind of thinking, wow, are they going to like me? Are they going to like me? And is there really a place for me? Answer to both those things is yes, absolutely. You come be a part. And if you're still kind of checking it out, sort of wondering, is this really, what? Come on, check it out. We'll get to the other stuff later. God is good. Any way we can serve you? Let's get connected. So we stand and sing.
Lay your burden down, every care you carry, and come to the table of grace, for there is mercy. Come just as you are, we are all unworthy to enter the presence of God, for He is holy. Lift up your heart, lift up your hands, fall on your knees and pray, for the King of Kings and the love He brings is here in this place. We raise our voices, raise our song, offer Him our praise, for the King of Kings and the joy He brings is here. He is here. Lift up your heart, lift up your hands, fall on your knees and pray, for the King of Kings and the love He brings is here in this place. We raise our voices, raise our song, offer Him our praise, for the King of Kings and the joy He brings is here. He is here, for the King of Kings and the joy He brings is